The courtroom buzzed with tension as Marcus Wellington sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Across the aisle, his wife of 7 years, Jennifer Wellington, dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, though whether the tears were genuine or performative remained unclear. Between them sat the focal point of this entire devastating ordeal, 3-year-old Emma, blissfully unaware that her entire existence was being questioned today. Marcus had always prided himself on being a logical man, an engineer by trade who dealt in facts and figures, measurements and certainties. But nothing in his carefully constructed life had prepared him for the moment 6 months ago, when he had discovered text messages on Jennifer's phone that shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. The messages weren't just from anyone. They were from Derek, his best friend since college, the man who had been his best man at their wedding, the person he had trusted implicitly with everything in his life. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could, leaving wounds that Marcus wasn't sure would ever heal. As he sat there waiting for the judge to enter, his mind raced back through every moment of Emma's life, searching for signs he might have missed, clues that should have told him something was wrong. She had his mother's eyes, or so he had always thought. She laughed like Jennifer's father, but did she have his nose, his chin? The questions that had never mattered before now consumed him entirely. The worst part wasn't just the possibility that Emma might not be his biological daughter. It was the certainty that his entire reality had been built on lies, that the woman he loved and the friend he cherished had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. Jennifer's perspective told a different story, one complicated by shame, regret, and desperate love for the family she feared losing. She had never intended for any of this to happen, and if she could turn back time, she would make different choices at every turn. Her affair with Derek had begun during a particularly difficult period in her marriage when Marcus had been working 80-hour weeks on a major project that consumed all his time and energy. She had felt lonely, abandoned, and increasingly invisible in her own home. Derek had been there, offering sympathy and understanding, listening to her complaints in ways that Marcus no longer seemed capable of doing. What started as innocent coffee meetings to vent about life's frustrations had gradually evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. Jennifer knew she should have stopped it before anything physical happened, but she had felt so starved for attention and affection that she had allowed herself to rationalize the growing emotional intimacy. The night it finally crossed the line into a physical affair, Jennifer had been drinking wine after a particularly painful argument with Marcus about his work schedule. Derek had stopped by to drop off some tools Marcus had lent him, and finding Jennifer upset and vulnerable, he had stayed to comfort her. One thing led to another, and before Jennifer fully comprehended what was happening, they had slept together. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, crushing her with its weight. She had ended things with Derek the very next day, telling him it could never happen again and begging him to pretend it had never occurred. For months, she convinced herself that this secret would die with her, that Marcus never needed to know about her moment of weakness, and that their marriage could recover once his project ended and he had more time for their family. The timeline of Emma's conception became the crucial question that haunted Marcus's every waking moment. Jennifer had become pregnant approximately 3 months after her affair with Derek, or at least that's what the dates seemed to suggest. She insisted that Emma was conceived during a weekend getaway she and Marcus had taken to the mountains, a trip designed to reconnect and repair some of the damage his work obsession had caused their relationship. Marcus remembered that weekend vividly. They had stayed in a cozy cabin, hiked through autumn leaves, made love by the fireplace, and talked about their future with more hope than they had felt in months. When Jennifer announced her pregnancy 6 weeks later, Marcus had been thrilled, seeing it as a new chapter in their lives and a symbol of their renewed commitment to each other. He had never questioned Emma's paternity for even a second during the pregnancy or in the 3 years since her birth. Emma was his daughter, his little girl, the light of his life, who greeted him with squeals of "Daddy" every evening when he came home from work. He had changed her diapers, walked the floors with her during colicky nights, taught her to blow bubbles, and read her bedtime stories every single evening without fail. But now, Derek's confession had poisoned all those memories, tainted every precious moment with doubt and suspicion. Derek had come to Marcus 3 months ago, consumed by guilt and unable to keep the secret any longer, especially after his own wife had discovered old text messages and threatened to expose the affair herself. The conversation had destroyed Marcus in ways he never imagined possible, learning in one devastating moment that both his wife and his best friend had betrayed him, and that the daughter he adored might not actually be his biological child. Derek Harrison sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, his head in his hands, looking like a man who had aged a decade in the past few months. His own marriage had fallen apart in the aftermath of his confession, his wife understandably unable to forgive his infidelity or trust him again. He had lost his best friend, potentially fathered a child in the worst possible circumstances, and destroyed 2 families with his selfishness and weakness. Derek had always considered himself a good person, someone who tried to do the right thing and treat others with respect and kindness. But his actions had proven otherwise, revealing character flaws he hadn't known existed within himself. The affair with Jennifer had been brief, really just that one night, but the consequences rippled outward in Everex, banding circles of pain and destruction. He had genuinely cared about Jennifer's unhappiness in her marriage, had listened sympathetically as she described feeling neglected and lonely while Marcus worked constantly. But if Derek was honest with himself, his sympathy had contained elements of attraction and self-interest that he hadn't acknowledged at the time. Jennifer was beautiful, vulnerable, and right there in front of him, and he had allowed himself to act on feelings that should have remained unspoken and unacted upon. The guilt had eaten at him for 3 years, growing more unbearable with each passing month, especially whenever he saw Emma. Every time Marcus had proudly shown him pictures of Emma's latest accomplishments or brought her to gatherings where she called him Uncle Derek, the knife of guilt twisted deeper into Derek's conscience. He had seriously considered taking a secret to the grave, never telling anyone what had happened and allowing Marcus to live in blissful ignorance, but his wife's discovery of the old text messages had forced his hand, and perhaps that was for the best even if it destroyed everything. The judge finally entered the courtroom, and everyone rose respectfully before settling back into their seats with anxious anticipation. Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over family court for 15 years and had seen virtually every variation of human drama, betrayal, and complicated relationships that existed. She approached each case with compassion, but also with a commitment to uncovering truth and acting in the best interests of any children involved. She reviewed the file before her, noting the paternity test results that had been submitted as evidence, along with statements from all parties involved. This case troubled her more than most because it involved not just questions of biological paternity, but the complete unraveling of multiple relationships and the potential devastation of a small child who had done nothing wrong but existed at the center of adult failures and betrayals. Judge Morrison believed strongly that biological paternity was important and that children deserved to know their true parentage. But she also recognized that fatherhood extended beyond mere genetics. The man who had raised a child loved her, cared for her daily needs, and formed an unbreakable bond through years of devoted parenting was a father in every meaningful sense, regardless of what DNA tests might reveal. However, the law had specific provisions about paternity, particularly when it came to matters of child support, inheritance rights, custody arrangements, and medical history. Judge Morrison knew her responsibility was to establish the biological truth and then determine what legal and practical arrangements would best serve Emma's welfare going forward. She looked at Marcus, seeing the pain and confusion written across his face, the desperate hope warring with dread in his eyes. She looked at Jennifer, noting the guilt and fear radiating from every pore. And she thought about Derek waiting outside, whose genetic contribution might be significant, but whose actual relationship with Emma was minimal at best. As the proceedings formally began, Jennifer was called to testify first, asked to explain the circumstances surrounding her affair and Emma's conception. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, Jennifer recounted the loneliness she had felt in her marriage during that difficult period, careful to acknowledge that her feelings didn't justify her actions, but explaining the emotional context nevertheless. She described the single night with Derek as a terrible mistake born of too much wine, too much emotional vulnerability, and too little judgment. She emphasized that the affair had been brief, that it had ended immediately afterward, and that she had genuinely believed Marcus was Emma's father based on the timing of conception. Jennifer explained that she and Marcus had been intimate multiple times during the period when Emma would have been conceived, making paternity unclear from the start. She had chosen to believe Marcus was the father because she desperately wanted that to be true, because it allowed her to preserve her marriage and family, and because she loved Marcus and wanted their child to be the product of their love rather than her betrayal. The judge listened without visible reaction, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific dates and details. When asked why she hadn't told Marcus about the affair sooner, Jennifer's voice broke as she explained that she had been too afraid. Afraid of losing her husband, afraid of destroying her family, afraid of Emma growing up in a broken home because of her mother's mistakes. She acknowledged that her silence had been selfish, that Marcus deserved to know the truth regardless of how painful it was, but that fear and shame had paralyzed her into maintaining the deception for years. Now that everything had been exposed, Jennifer said she simply wanted to know the truth, to deal with whatever reality they faced, and to figure out how to move forward in a way that minimized harm to Emma above all else. When Marcus took the stand, his testimony was marked by a controlled anger that simmered just beneath the surface of his carefully measured words. He described the profound betrayal he felt upon learning about Jennifer's affair, made infinitely worse by the fact that it had been with Derek, someone he had trusted completely and considered closer than a brother. Marcus talked about the sleepless nights he had endured since learning the truth, lying awake questioning every memory, every moment of Emma's life, wondering if he had been played for a fool by the two people he loved most. He described the torture of looking at Emma's face, this child he adored beyond measure, and seeing features that might belong to someone else, someone who had violated every code of friendship and loyalty that Marcus held sacred. Yet even as he spoke of his pain and anger, Marcus's voice softened when he talked about Emma herself, about the joy she brought to his life, about reading bedtime stories and playing tea party, about teaching her to ride her tricycle and watching her face light up with wonder at simple things. He admitted to the judge that regardless of what the DNA test showed, he had been Emma's father in every meaningful way for the past 3 years, and the thought of losing her shattered him even more than Jennifer's betrayal. Marcus explained that he had requested the paternity test, not because he wanted to abandon Emma if she wasn't biologically his, but because he needed to know the truth, needed to have one solid fact in a world that had become quicks and beneath his feet. He acknowledged that learning Emma wasn't his biological daughter would devastate him, but that he couldn't move forward with any decisions about his life until he knew what reality he was actually dealing with. Marcus's greatest fear wasn't the test result itself, but rather what would happen afterward. Would he have legal rights to continue seeing Emma if she wasn't his biological child? And Jennifer decided to cut him out of her life. Derek's testimony, delivered via video conference since he was now living in another state trying to rebuild his life, added another layer of complication to the already tangled situation. He confirmed Jennifer's account of their affair, acknowledging his complete responsibility for betraying his best friend and making choices that had destroyed multiple lives. Derek explained that he had wrestled with guilt for 3 years, knowing he should tell Marcus the truth, but convincing himself that ignorance might be kinder, that destroying Marcus's happiness served no good purpose if Emma really was Marcus's biological daughter anyway. He had finally confessed when his wife discovered evidence of the affair, because the alternative was allowing her to be the one to tell Marcus, which seemed even crueler. Derek stated clearly that he had no interest in trying to claim paternity rights or insert himself into Emma's life as a father figure if the test showed he was her biological father. He recognized that his genetic contribution, if it existed, was an accident born of terrible judgment, and that Marcus was Emma's real father in every way that mattered. Derek acknowledged that this position might seem cowardly, like he was trying to avoid responsibility, but he genuinely believed that Emma's best interests lay in maintaining her relationship with Marcus rather than having Derek disrupt her life. He offered to pay child support if required by law, to provide medical history information if needed, and to stay completely out of Emma's life if that was what Marcus and Jennifer decided was best. The judge questioned Derek extensively about his motivations and feelings, trying to determine whether his hands-off approach was truly about Emma's welfare or simply about avoiding the complications and responsibilities of fatherhood. Derek maintained that while he certainly felt overwhelmed by the situation, his primary concern was minimizing disruption and trauma for a 3-year-old child who had done nothing wrong and deserved stability and love rather than being caught in adult drama. The court-ordered DNA test results sat in a sealed envelope before the judge, representing a truth that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple lives regardless of what it revealed. Judge Morrison explained to everyone present that DNA testing had become extremely accurate and reliable, with modern technology capable of determining paternity with certainty exceeding 99%. The tests that had been conducted examined numerous genetic markers, comparing Emma's DNA to samples provided by both Marcus and Derek. Before opening the envelope, the judge took time to counsel all parties about the implications of whatever they were about to learn. She emphasized that biological paternity was just one factor in determining what family relationships looked like going forward, and that courts increasingly recognized the importance of preserving bonds between children and the adults who had functioned as their parents regardless of genetic connections. She explained that if Marcus was not Emma's biological father, he might still be able to maintain legal parental rights depending on various factors, including how long he had acted as her father, what was in Emma's best interests, and what arrangements the adults could agree upon. Conversely, if Derek was Emma's biological father, that didn't automatically entitle him to custody or visitation rights, especially if he chose not to pursue such rights, and if granting them would be disruptive to Emma's stability and well-being. The judge reminded everyone that Emma was the only truly innocent party in this situation, a child who had been loved and cared for, and who deserved to continue being loved and cared for regardless of what genetic testing revealed. She urged the adults to think carefully about Emma's needs rather than their own hurt feelings, anger, or desire for revenge or vindication. With that context established, Judge Morrison carefully opened the envelope and reviewed the results privately before looking up to address the courtroom with news that would change everything. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Judge Morrison prepared to reveal the paternity test results, the tension so thick it felt difficult to breathe. Marcus sat perfectly still, his entire body rigid with anticipation and dread, simultaneously desperate to know and terrified to learn the truth. Jennifer's hands trembled visibly as she clutched her tissue, tears streaming down her face before any words had even been spoken. The judge's expression remained professionally neutral as she began to speak, explaining first that the test had been conducted properly, that the samples had been collected and analyzed according to strict protocols, and that the results were scientifically conclusive. Then she delivered the news that Marcus had been dreading. The DNA test conclusively excluded him as Emma's biological father, meaning that Derek was almost certainly Emma's father given the circumstances and timing involved. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, even though part of him had been expecting this outcome. Hearing it stated as scientific fact, as incontrovertible truth rather than terrible possibility, made it real in a way that speculation never could. Marcus felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him, as though he were falling through empty space with nothing to catch him. The little girl he had rocked to sleep as an infant, whose first steps he had witnessed, whose tears he had dried, and whose laughter he had cherished, was not biologically his child. 3 years of fatherhood, 3 years of building bonds and creating memories and establishing identity. And now he learned it had all been based on a lie. Jennifer sobbed openly at the news, whether from relief at finally knowing the truth or from grief at the pain this would cause Marcus, or most likely from some complicated mixture of both emotions. Judge Morrison allowed a moment for the information to be absorbed before continuing, but her next words were firm and clear. Biological paternity was not the end of this story, but rather just the beginning of figuring out what came next. In the aftermath of the devastating revelation, the judge turned her attention to the practical and legal implications of the paternity test results. She acknowledged that while Derek was Emma's biological father, Marcus had established himself as Emma's psychological father through 3 years of devoted parenting, creating bonds that were real and significant even if not based on genetic connection. Judge Morrison explained that family law recognized the concept of psychological parentage, or de facto parentage, in many jurisdictions, understanding that children form attachments to the adults who raise them regardless of biological relationships. She noted that courts had increasingly moved away from a purely genetics-based understanding of parenthood toward a more nuanced appreciation of what it meant to be a parent in functional, emotional, and practical terms. The judge asked Marcus directly what he wanted in terms of his ongoing relationship with Emma, whether he wished to maintain his parental role or whether learning she wasn't biologically his had changed his feelings and commitment. Marcus answered without hesitation, his voice thick with emotion, that Emma was his daughter in every way that mattered to him, that he loved her completely, and that the thought of losing her from his life was unbearable. He acknowledged that the betrayal by Jennifer and Derek had shattered his trust and probably destroyed his marriage beyond repair, but that none of that was Emma's fault, and his love for her remained unchanged by genetic testing. The judge then turned to Jennifer, asking about her wishes for Emma's future and what kind of custody and parenting arrangements she envisioned. Jennifer stated that despite everything that had happened, she believed Marcus was a wonderful father to Emma and that it would be cruel and harmful to separate them simply because of biological facts that Emma was too young to understand or care about. She expressed willingness to work out custody arrangements that allowed Marcus to continue being a major presence in Emma's life, regardless of what happened to their marriage. The question of Derek's role in Emma's future became the next complex issue to address, one that had no easy answers or clear precedent. Derek had stated his preference to remain uninvolved in Emma's life, believing that his presence would only complicate and disrupt the relationship between Emma and Marcus. However, the judge explained that regardless of Derek's preferences, he had certain legal obligations as Emma's biological father, particularly regarding financial support. Under state law, biological parents had a duty to support their children financially, and courts could not simply ignore that obligation because it was inconvenient or because another person had been functioning as the child's father. Judge Morrison asked Derek directly whether he understood that he might be ordered to pay child support, and whether he was prepared to fulfill that responsibility. Derek confirmed that he understood and was willing to pay support as required, seeing it as the absolute minimum he could do given the circumstances and his role in creating this terrible situation. However, the judge also needed to address the question of Derek's parental rights, which existed separately from his obligations, Even if Derek didn't want to exercise custody or visitation rights currently, those rights existed and couldn't simply be signed away without proper legal proceedings. The judge explained that if Marcus wished to maintain full parental rights and responsibilities for Emma, the cleanest legal path would be for Derek to voluntarily terminate his parental rights and for Marcus to formally adopt Emma, creating a legal parent-child relationship that matched the functional reality of their lives. However, this process required Derek's cooperation and Jennifer's consent, as well as a court's determination that such an arrangement served Emma's best interests. Derek stated his willingness to terminate his rights if that was what everyone agreed was best, acknowledging that he had no desire to disrupt Emma's life or confuse her with multiple father figures when she already had a dad who loved her. As the hearing continued, the focus shifted to the practical arrangements for Emma's immediate future, while the legal processes of adoption and rights termination worked their way through the system. Judge Morrison emphasized that regardless of what paperwork eventually said, the priority had to be maintaining stability and continuity in Emma's life during a time when the adult relationships around her were in upheaval. The judge noted that Emma was at an age where she was forming core memories and developing her sense of security and attachment, making it crucial that her daily routines and primary relationships remain as consistent as possible despite the chaos in the adult world. Marcus and Jennifer would need to work out custody arrangements for Emma just as any divorcing couple would, determining where Emma would primarily live, how time would be divided, and how decisions about her upbringing would be made. The judge recommended strongly that both parents engage in family counseling to help them navigate the emotional complexity of their situation and develop healthy co-parenting strategies despite the betrayal and hurt that existed between them. She also suggested that they might benefit from working with a child psychologist who could provide guidance on how and when to eventually explain Emma's origins to her as she grew older and began asking questions. The judge acknowledged that Marcus and Jennifer would likely divorce given the circumstances, and that this would be painful and difficult for everyone involved, but urged them to keep Emma's needs at the center of every decision rather than allowing hurt feelings or desires for revenge to drive their choices. She reminded them that Emma would be watching and learning from how they handled this situation, and that the way they treated each other would shape Emma's understanding of relationships and conflict resolution for the rest of her life. The judge also addressed the financial arrangements that would need to be established, including child support from Derek, the division of assets between Marcus and Jennifer, and the practical realities of maintaining two households for Emma's benefit. Jennifer requested an opportunity to address the court directly, wanting to explain her perspective and express remorse for the pain her choices had caused. The judge allowed this, and Jennifer stood shakily to speak, her voice trembling with emotion as she tried to articulate the complicated feelings she had been wrestling with for months. She began by acknowledging that everything happening today was entirely her fault, that her moment of weakness and years of dishonesty had created this nightmare scenario that was hurting everyone she cared about. Jennifer explained that she had never stopped loving Marcus even during the period when she had felt neglected and lonely, and that her affair with Derek had been about filling a temporary void rather than about any deep feelings for Derek himself. She recognized that this explanation probably made things worse rather than better, that it highlighted the casual nature of her betrayal and the minimal thought she had given to the catastrophic consequences of her actions. Jennifer spoke directly to Marcus, saying that she understood if he could never forgive her, that she had destroyed his trust and their marriage through her selfishness and cowardice. She told him that whatever he needed from her going forward in terms of custody, divorce proceedings, or any other arrangements, she would cooperate fully because she owed him at least that much after everything she had taken from him. Jennifer also addressed the question of Emma's future, expressing her gratitude that Marcus still wanted to be part of Emma's life, despite learning she wasn't his biological daughter. She promised to support his continued relationship with Emma in every way possible, never using the biological truth as a weapon or attempting to cut him out of Emma's life. Jennifer acknowledged that she deserved to lose Marcus as a husband, that her actions had made their marriage untenable, but she didn't believe Emma deserved to lose the only father she had ever known simply because of her mother's mistakes. Marcus also requested permission to address the court, needing to articulate his feelings and intentions for the record and for his own sense of closure. He spoke of the profound betrayal he felt, of the shattering of his fundamental understanding of his life and relationships. Marcus described the particular pain of being betrayed not just by his wife, but by his best friend, of having two of the most important relationships in his life revealed as built on deception and lies. He talked about the nights he had lain awake replaying every memory, every conversation, every interaction, searching for signs he should have noticed, clues that could have warned him about what was happening behind his back. Marcus acknowledged the anger he felt toward both Jennifer and Derek, admitting that there were moments when he wanted to make them suffer as he was suffering, wanted them to feel even a fraction of the pain their actions had caused him. But then he would think about Emma, about her innocent smile and her complete trust in him as her daddy. And he would remember that revenge and anger were luxuries he couldn't afford if he wanted to maintain his relationship with his daughter. Marcus stated clearly for the record that despite the DNA test results, Emma was his daughter in every meaningful sense, and he intended to remain her father regardless of the legal and practical complications this choice might create. He explained that he was willing to go through adoption proceedings if necessary to fight for custody rights, to pay child support, or to do whatever the law required to preserve his relationship with Emma. Marcus also addressed Derek directly, even though Derek was participating remotely, saying that while he might someday be able to forgive the affair, he could never rebuild their friendship, and he expected Derek to honor his commitment to stay out of Emma's life. He made clear that he wasn't trying to deny Derek's biological reality, but rather asking him to recognize that biology alone didn't make someone a father, and that Emma deserved consistency rather than confusion. The judge took all the testimony and statements into consideration before beginning to outline her recommendations and the legal path forward for this family. She started by praising Marcus for his commitment to Emma, despite the pain and betrayal he had experienced, noting that his willingness to continue being her father spoke to his character and to the genuine nature of the bond they had formed. Judge Morrison explained that she would be supportive of Marcus pursuing adoption proceedings to formalize his parental status, particularly if Derek was willing to voluntarily terminate his rights and Jennifer supported the adoption. She outlined the steps this process would require, including home studies, background checks, counseling sessions, and ultimately a formal adoption hearing that would legally establish Marcus as Emma's father regardless of genetic testing. The judge emphasized that this adoption would give Marcus the same legal rights and responsibilities as any biological parent, protecting his relationship with Emma even if his marriage to Jennifer ended. However, she also cautioned that the process would take time, potentially 6 months to a year depending on various factors, and during that interim period, they would need temporary custody arrangements that preserved everyone's rights and interests. Judge Morrison ordered a temporary custody schedule that gave Marcus significant parenting time with Emma, reflecting his role as her primary father figure despite the biological revelation. She ordered Derek to begin paying child support according to state guidelines, while acknowledging that Marcus would continue to financially support Emma, as he always had, because that was what parents did regardless of legal obligations. The judge also ordered all parties to participate in counseling, individual therapy for Marcus, Jennifer, and Derek to help them process their emotions and trauma, and co-parenting counseling for Marcus and Jennifer to help them develop healthy communication patterns focused on Emma's needs. Finally, Judge Morrison addressed the question of what and when Emma would be told about her biological origins, recommending that they consult with a child's psychologist about the appropriate age and method for sharing this information. As the hearing drew to a close, Judge Morrison took a moment to address the broader implications of cases like this one, speaking not just to the parties involved, but articulating principles that applied to family relationships more generally. She spoke about how the definition of family had evolved over time, how society had moved beyond purely biological understandings of parenthood to recognize the profound importance of psychological bonds, daily caretaking, and emotional commitment. The judge noted that families came in many configurations: biological, adoptive, step, parent, foster, and various other arrangements, and that what made a family real wasn't genetics, but rather love, commitment, consistency, and mutual care. She acknowledged that betrayal and infidelity caused real harm and broke trust in ways that were difficult or sometimes impossible to repair. But she also emphasized that children shouldn't bear the consequences of adult failures. Judge Morrison spoke directly about the importance of adults putting aside their hurt and anger when making decisions that affected children, of prioritizing stability and love over biological technicalities or desires for revenge. She praised Marcus again for his emotional maturity in separating his feelings about Jennifer's betrayal from his feelings about Emma herself, recognizing that these were distinct issues that deserved distinct responses. The judge also acknowledged Derek's position, noting that while his behavior had been deeply wrong and harmful, his willingness to step aside and allow Marcus to continue being Emma's father showed at least some understanding of what Emma's best interests required. She expressed hope that all parties would continue to put Emma first as they navigated the divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, and adoption process that lay ahead. Judge Morrison concluded by reminding everyone that while the truth revealed today was painful, it also provided an opportunity for healing and rebuilding on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. She expressed confidence that with time, therapy, and commitment to doing what was right for Emma, this family could find a new equilibrium that served everyone's needs, even if it looked different from what any of them had originally imagined. In the weeks and months following the dramatic courtroom hearing, each person involved in this tangled situation began the difficult work of moving forward and rebuilding their lives. Marcus proceeded with divorce proceedings against Jennifer, unable to rebuild trust or maintain a romantic relationship with someone who had betrayed him so fundamentally. However, he remained committed to co-parenting Emma effectively, attending school events, maintaining his regular parenting schedule, and ensuring that Emma felt loved and secure despite the changes happening around her. He started individual therapy to process his feelings of betrayal and to work through the complicated emotions surrounding Emma's paternity, finding that while the pain didn't disappear, it gradually became more manageable as he focused on the present rather than the past. Marcus began the adoption process as recommended by the judge, working through the required steps to legally formalize what had always been true in his heart, that Emma was his daughter regardless of genetics. Jennifer moved into her own apartment and began rebuilding her life as a single mother, carrying the weight of guilt for destroying her marriage, but also finding some relief in no longer maintaining the exhausting deception that had haunted her for years. She attended counseling as ordered and worked hard to develop a healthy co-parenting relationship with Marcus, respecting his boundaries while ensuring he remained fully involved in Emma's life. Derek followed through on his commitment to stay out of Emma's life beyond paying child support, voluntarily terminating his parental rights as part of Marcus's adoption proceedings. He moved to another state for a fresh start, beginning his own therapy journey to understand the choices he had made and to become a better person going forward. And Emma, blissfully unaware of all the adult drama and legal proceedings swirling around her, continued to be a happy 3-year-old who loved her mommy and daddy, enjoyed playing with dolls and building blocks, and looked forward to ice cream and bedtime stories. The adults in her life had made terrible mistakes and caused each other immense pain, But they had also made the crucial decision to protect her from the fallout of their failures, ensuring that she continued to feel loved, secure, and valued. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, they would tell her the truth about her biological origins in age-appropriate ways. But for now, the most important truth was simply that she was loved unconditionally by the people who mattered most in her young life, and that love was what would carry her forward regardless of what genetics might say.